Hello and welcome to the channel. I'm Veloce, and today we're going to be benchmarking the 3090 against the 4090. And the PC we're going to be using is the brand new 7950X on an Asus ProArt motherboard with 32 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM at 6000 megahertz. And we're going to be comparing the Founders 3090 versus the Asus TUF OC 4090. And I had an overclock on both of them. I want to say I had about 100 megahertz on the 3090 core clock and 1000 memory. And then on the Asus, I had a 200 core clock and also 1000 megahertz on the memory. Now I did both of these on Windows 11, and from what I've seen online and even seen in some of my tests, there seems to be some issues with 7950X and the scheduler in Windows 11. So particularly in ACC, I did kind of get some weird results, and I'll go over that more when we get to it. But there might end up being even more performance and more headroom in the future with some driver updates and things like that. In my next video, I'll be comparing the 7950X with the 5800X 3D, and there's some interesting results there, particularly in ACC and VR. So in these tests, I mainly did triple 4K. I did do triple 1440p for a couple titles, but both of these cards are gonna be do just fine in triple 1440p. The 3090 already does as much as you really need for triple 1440p, you know, well over in the hundreds of FPS. ACC is really only title where you'd want more power, but I'll showcase that as well. So I mainly focused on like triple 4K to just get like a usable benchmark. I mean, I don't really find it that usable to find out that we can get 300 FPS in triple 1440 or 500 FPS in triple 1080p. Like, it's pointless. Like, there's no reason to even use a 4090 for that use case. So I kind of try to do my test in more usable situations. So I mostly focused on the triple 4K, which is what I run for my sim rig, and VR, because unless you're running one of those scenarios, it's not really worth it to get a 4090. Definitely just get a much cheaper card, maybe one of the 4080s or a good 30 series card. So without further ado, let's just get into the benchmarks. So here's one of the tests that I did do in 1440p on the original Assetto Corsa at max graphics, and as you can see here, the 3090 is already doing good enough at 160 FPS average frame rate, and the 4090 is just absolutely obliterating it at 270 FPS. So a lot of these sim racing titles at 1440p are kind of going to have similar results. So really, if this is your use case, I don't recommend buying 4090, just save the money. Now here we have where the 4090 has a much more usable improvement in my opinion. We're at triple 4K max graphics. We are going from 81 FPS, which by the way is still very usable, still a very good experience. So if you can still run a 3090 at triple 4K, and I did for a good amount of time, and still a great experience. But this is where the 4090 starts having value by getting well over that 100 FPS threshold, where I start to think everything gets a lot smoother and a better experience. So at 134, that's well over the cap of my 4K monitors, which is 120. So we have some extra room there. So overall, really great performance from the 4090 here. And here we have VR. Once again, we go back to not being that worth it, maybe unless you were using a very, very high resolution VR headset or wanted to super sample an extreme amount. But the 3090 still does a very good job here, and Assetto Corsa for VR. The 4090 just allows us to have that much more stable 144 Hertz cap of my Valve Index VR headset. All right, so here's one of the most demanding of sim racing titles, Assetto Corsa Competizione, triple 1440p with DLSS set to quality and all settings as high as they can go at Epic. And this is a hot lap scenario, so just on an open track, no AI or anything like that. So basically the best conditions we could get for just trying to get as much frames as possible at the highest quality. And here the 3090, 95 FPS at 1440p, still very good. But if you want to hit that 144 hertz cap that you might have of a 1440p monitor, the 4090 does allow you to achieve that with an average FPS of 166.5 in this scenario. So this is where things start to get a little bit weird, and where I think there might be issues with the 7950X and Windows 11, because we're only getting about 10 more FPS when we started to add a full 29 grid of AI cars into the mix. When I was doing my test with the 7950X versus the 5800X 3D, which will be in a future video, I was getting about 130-ish FPS, I believe, on the 5800X 3D. So the 4090 should be doing well above this performance, and it looks like we're having some sort of, technical difficulty with drivers or Windows or something like that. Now going to 4K in a hot lap scenario, we see a pretty good bump of roughly about 30 FPS increase over the 3090, which a 30 FPS bump at, from 70 FPS to 100 FPS is a pretty significant jump, especially with completely maxed out graphics and DLSS quality. This is the use case I was most looking forward to the improvements for my setup, and I do think this was quite a nice jump. And of course you can mess around with the settings if you wanted even more, but I'm pretty satisfied with 100 FPS at triple 4K. And we still see a great improvement when adding AI cards to the mix. The issues I'm having with Windows or the new CPU don't seem to be affecting the 4K results like they were the 1440p results. So this is a huge improvement, much more playable. When you're in the 50s, technically, yes, it is still playable, but that's not really where I'd recommend playing. So another nice boost from the 4090 here. And now we're in VR in a hot lap, and here we see a huge increase in performance over the 3090 for VR, about 40 FPS. In my previous VR benchmarking video, I believe I got about 100 average FPS in the 4090, and I did the test again and I got 124 this time. And once again, the 5800X3D kind of crushed the 7950X. So really, once again, we should be getting more performance than this with the 4090, but I mean, this is still a significant improvement with the 3090, even with the issues I've been having. In the VR racing configuration with max graphics, and by the way, I'm not using DLSS in VR. For some reason, DLSS in VR Simracing titles, or maybe just in all VR, makes the game look much blurrier, so I prefer to use the temporal anti-aliasing for a clearer image. But here we get a pretty good boost over the 3090. When it comes to VR, your 1% lows are extremely important, which are much better on the 4090 here, and our average FPS is much better as well. So in my opinion, Assetto Corsa Competizione is kind of finally playable in VR. I would still recommend messing around with the settings, but overall a good performance. All right, here we have Automobilista 2 in a full grid, I believe about 20 cars on Bathurst AI race. And here, large performance increase at triple 4K. You can see that 4090 is hitting that 121 FPS, which perfect for my use case. Once again, 120 FPS is my target for my monitors. So fully usable at max graphics in 4K with the 4090, which is awesome. And the 3090 still a decent performance, and of course would still do very well with some adjustments to the graphic settings to get even more FPS, but huge leap with the 4090 here. And now we have Automobilista 2 in the same conditions in VR, and this is one of the most beautiful results. Now, the reason the 3090 is at 72 FPS is actually because of, it seems like Steam is forcing asynchronous reprojection, which basically caps your frame rate at a much lower frame rate to have a smoother experience, so it stays more consistently at that frame rate. So while the 3090 might actually be capable of more FPS, the 4090 doesn't get hit by that bottleneck and stays at the full capped 144 Hz of my Valve Index headset. You could definitely get more performance out of the 3090 here with playing the settings, or maybe not dealing with SteamVR's forced reprojection. Of course, the AI cars are probably the reason why that's happening. So if you're mostly racing multiplayer, you might not run into this issues, and you might have more like, 80 FPS, 90 FPS. I'm not totally sure, but definitely still more headroom in the 3090, I believe. And here we have iRacing. As you can see, at triple 4K in a hot lap or practice scenario, both the 3090 and the 4090 are doing fantastic, getting well above 100 FPS. 4090 obviously doing a much better job at that, but still hitting a good target with 3090. This is with the max quality preset, so there is still many settings you can play with even further. And the 4090 is going to allow you to do that much more than the 3090 will. And as you can also see, if these are getting this frame rate at 4K, you know both of them are going to absolutely crush 1440p. So unless you're racing in iRacing at triple 4K for triple screens, you probably could save your money and not get the 4090. And then here we have the same conditions in a race with AI cars, about 20 cars on the grid on Suzuka, and the 4090 is just doing a better job. It would keep my monitors pretty much capped, other than they both have very similar 1% lows, and that's probably more to do with the CPU performance. But yeah, both still doing a pretty good job here. And here we get to VR. These are probably even both overkill for iRacing and VR, but like I said, this is the max quality preset, so you could still push it further, but iRacing isn't all that demanding in VR, so you definitely don't need to go crazy for this scenario, unless maybe you're running like a HPG2 headset or the Aero headset. And here in a racing situation, you pretty much tell that we are CPU bottlenecked in VR, racing against the 20 AI cars. So both doing just fine. A little bit more consistent frames and better 1% lows in the 4090, which is important in VR, I will say that. Once again, 4090, probably overkill for iRacing. So here's F1 2022, and this is just at 4K because it doesn't have native triple support, and you can spoof it with surround to get triples, but I figured I would just test it in the way it's kind of designed to be played. So here's F1 2022 at 4K max graphics with DLSS quality. So we're also running maxed out ray tracing settings too, so as demanding as we could possibly make the game. And here we see a huge leap with the 4090 over the 3090. And if this is a use case you're looking for, you could definitely argue that the 4090 is well worth it over the 3090, because almost getting close to double the performance here. And in VR, it gets even better with the performance uplift. We're hitting the asynchronous reprojection forced by Steam VR again. That's why we're getting that 72 average FPS. So 3090 might still have a little bit more headroom if it wasn't being forced to do that, but nowhere near the performance that the 4090 is getting here. It's just absolutely destroying it. And not using DLSS in VR because of the blurrier image that DLSS gives in VR. Here we're using temporal anti-aliasing with Fidelity FX sharpening for the best and clearest image I think this game provides. And another title in just 4K, not triples because it has no native triple screen support. But this is Dirt Rally 2.0 at 4K max graphics. Looks like I missed the 2.0 on accident, I'm sorry. But here we are getting another huge performance leap of 90 FPS over the 3090 at 4K, although the 3090 is doing perfectly fine at 4K. So definitely overkill to get 200 FPS plus at 4K, but if you're using triple screens with surround, even though the game doesn't natively support it, you'll definitely get a boost in performance there as well. And then in VR, the cursed 72 FPS again in this title as well with a 3090 at max graphics. And the 4090, once again, just absolutely blowing it out of the water, hitting the cap refresh rate of the Index headset. So as we can see, the 4090 is extremely powerful, and there does still seem to be some issues with Windows 11 and the 7950X in those some niche scenarios, but even still, 4090 for triple 4K is a massive boost in performance, and for VR as well. So in those use cases, you know, it might be worth it, but also the 3090, you know, still does a great job, and you don't have to play in ultra settings. Oftentimes, you know, unless you are looking at a side-by-side picture, and even sometimes if you were looking at a side-by-side picture, it's hard to tell the difference between like ultra and high, and the performance loss from going high to ultra is usually much more significant of loss of performance versus the fidelity gain. So I would say Just because the new stuff is out doesn't mean you can't have a great experience with last gen components. And I hope this helps you figure out what would be the best use case for your scenario, because like I said, for 1440p, in most cases, the 4090 is probably just overkill. Like I said, the 3090 is still a great option. I mean, 3080s and 3080 Ti's, all of those have been going on great sales, still fantastic options. And if you really want that extra horsepower, the 4090 is there to deliver for sure. So if you enjoyed this video, I'd greatly appreciate a thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel if you want to see some more sim racing content and tech content in the future. And I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.